Alright, Malachy Murray here for New York Talk, and again we got the hot mic here in New York City. It's August 2020, and we're still shut in, unfortunately, and it's hot. It's hot as crazy out there, man. Still got that heat wave. We're inside because we're shut in. Well, we're inside the studio anyway, and I can't have the air conditioning on because you'd hear it in this thing, so I'm going to be sitting here sweating. What else? We still got the protests going on, a little crazy out there. Again, with the hot mic, we're trying to keep that noise out and insulate you from some of that. I don't know, I hope this ends soon. When you go outside, even with your mask on, it's kind of hard to, no one's making eye contact with anybody. It's a really weird time. If you're in New York City in 2020 in August, you know what I'm talking about. This episode we're going to bring to you, this history lesson, is going to be all about power. And it comes in many forms here in New York City. A good storyteller will try and tie everything together with some common thread. He'll find some irony or something to tie everything together nicely. Just so happens that the protagonists that we're going to talk about today in our story happen to be either Scottish or of Scottish descent. Not all of them, but most of them. Which is kind of interesting because New York was set up by the Dutch and then later on the English, and you very rarely hear about any of the Scottish that helped set this country up and run it. And not until we did this deep dive, or at least I did. I wasn't really aware of this, but I'm kind of proud of that because I'm part Scottish, and I went out and found my Murray colors. So these are the colors of one of the Murray tartans. So I haven't been there yet. I plan on going. Also, August. There's a lot of. August is the one month in America where there's no federal holidays. It's 31 days. You got to just slog through it, but it's part of the summer. Unless you're like me and you got a birthday in August. Kind of got lucky to have parents that were pretty happy in November, so they can have I can have a holiday every month of the year. But in Scotland, they got all kinds of crazy holidays going on in August. They got that Viking festival. They got the tattoo festival. They got all these strongman competition things. They got pipes and drums and organs and all kinds of great Scottish festivities. And I'm gonna make it there one day. It sounds like a fun. Scottish people are a ball, especially here in New York City. They're just people born to have fun, and we love that here. That adds a lot to our dynamic culture. So, all right, Scotland should be proud of this one, and we'll be back and talk about some power. All right, power. There's a lot of places to start this story. It was kind of hard to put it all together. There's a lot of information in this episode. Let's start with the Louisiana Purchase. That was in 1803, so figure we'll set that up for you. Thomas Jefferson's the president. He's the third president of the United States of America. He kicked Aaron Burr off his ticket. Burr killed Hamilton, so he doesn't want anything to do with that. So he brings in a New Yorker, a guy named George Clinton. George was a 5-time governor of New York. He was also a governor while he was a general in the American Revolution. So the Clintons, they were a very powerful family from New York, and so was another guy named Chancellor, or Robert Livingston, from a very well-to-do family. They were also of Scottish descent. His father was a judge. He ended up being a judge. Brilliant jurist. The judge who swore in George Washington took the oath of office in Federal Hall in New York City. It's the Livingston Bible that Washington swore upon. One of the authors of the Declaration of Independence, the original author, he wrote the first draft. He worked out with Jefferson, Franklin, a couple other guys. He's also worked on the Constitution, too, with James Madison. Very well educated. Columbia University or King's College back in those days. Graduate who studied not only law, but all sorts of other stuff. A classmate of his was Colonel John Stevens. And John Stevens invented one of the first steam engines in America. So he went into business with him on steamboats. Thomas Jefferson decides that America's going to collapse unless we can get the port of New Orleans, which is owned by the French. The 13 colonies don't access Louisiana. They come nowhere near New Orleans. Okay, the 13 colonies stops at Georgia. And most of those colonies go out west to the Mississippi River. So we have some Mississippi River access, but we have to stop in Georgia because below Georgia is the Florida territory, which is owned by Spain. But the port of New Orleans falls squarely on the lap of France, and that's what Thomas Jefferson wants. The Mississippi River has some very powerful currents. They run downstream, so sail and tide, it's useless to go against the tide. You can only go down the river. So the people to trade on the Mississippi River, they do it on these these flat bottom barges, and they operate by sticking poles in the mud and going down, and it's like their braking system. They stop at the town, they jam the poles in the water, and they kind of walk it through the current up to the side. They buy, they sell, they buy, they sell, and they go out in the river and they go down further again. They get to the end, they get to Georgia somewhere, and they got to take the boat apart and start all over again, take a carriage back to whatever city they're from, and they're going to go broke doing this. We don't have the technology. What is the technology that would defy that would be the steam engine, which will come just a little bit later on. But the first thing you have to do is you have to get that port in New Orleans. Thomas Jefferson tasks Chancellor Robert Livingston to be the ambassador to France. Now, here's Livingston. Did a million things. Very, very intelligent, very well-rounded, very people, comes from good pedigree, big money, New York money. So sure, he jumps at the opportunity. He's got a lot of friends with French influence through his family connections. He goes over to France. He meets the same people over there that helped negotiate our independence. Jefferson tasks him with the negotiation of the port of New Orleans. So at the same time, now Napoleon takes power in France, and Napoleon wants to take over the world. So good luck trying to get any land from him, because he wants the whole thing. Alright, now back to steam power. Went from political power, money power, now back to steam power again. Okay, so the only steam engine in the world is in England. It's the famous Watt engine. That was an improvement on the Newcomb engine by an inventor named James Watt. 1774 came up with the Watt engine, and this is England's pride and joy. England isn't exporting this anywhere, especially to her colonies. This is what gives England the edge over all the other countries in the world. They got this engine. But the Americans are pretty close behind. We have some brilliant tinkerers and curious minds over here, and we're starting to develop a steam engine of our own. It's not as good as the Watt engine yet, but we're getting there. And these guys over in America have really no civil engineering background at all. They're just tinkerers, but they're figuring it out. The first guy to the game was a guy named Jonathan Fitch, a Yankee from Connecticut. He invents the first steam engine on a ferry boat he puts in the Delaware River. Now, not too far behind and not too far away is another inventor named James Rumney, who was in talks with George Washington on getting steamboats on the Potomac River. Although Fitch and Rumsey are the first to the game, they both end up dying broke. Over in New York, you got Chancellor Robert Livingston get into a partnership with a former classmate of his, another proud Scot ancestor, John Stevens, Colonel John Stevens III. From New Jersey. He's got an estate over there in Hoboken, very proud patriot in the American Revolution, from a long line of very successful Scottish merchants. Marries Sarah Cox. They have 13 kids, amazingly large family. Tragically, some die very young. But 4 of his sons turn out to be engineers like himself. Now, he's in a partnership with Chancellor Robert Livingston, who marries John Stevens' sister, Mary. So this relationship gets even more complicated as we go on. We're not going to put it all out right now, but John Stevens actually names one of his sons after his business partner. His son Robert Livingston Stevens is named after Chancellor Stevens, and he goes on to become a great engineer himself. Anyway, back to political power. Thomas Jefferson is tasked with going to France, so that kind of relationship kind of dissolves a little bit, and the Stevens are kind of on their own, but his sons are of age, or close enough to it, and they're what Stevens did, interestingly enough, he built screw propellers. That was his method of propulsion. Fitch had these pistons in the water. Now, he came up with his idea when Fitch was being chased by Native Americans. It was during the Revolutionary War, and he was out doing some experiments, and he saw these Native Americans paddling after him with their canoes, and he saw how there was 6 in each canoe on each side, and the oars were hitting the water with military precision. And so that stayed in his head. The Native Americans captured him. They ransomed him to the British. He was a prisoner of war, both the Native Americans and then the British. And then the British lost interest in him somehow, and they released him. But he kept that image in his head of those paddles hitting the water. So he invents this thing where this wheel turns around and these sticks hit the water, and it really looks awkward and clunky, and it works for a little while, but it only goes about 4 miles an hour. And again, Rumsey learns from that a little bit. Rumsey sat down with President George Washington and discussed ideas of how he wanted to tame the Potomac River, and Rumsey put a steamboat on the Potomac River. All right, now to digress again. There's a guy from Pennsylvania. He's not a New Yorker, but he does spend a lot of time here. His name is Robert Fulton. Robert Fulton is a very talented artist. In fact, his father is very good friends with the father of probably the most talented artist of his time, a guy named Benjamin West. And he's another American. He's over in England now, and he sets up the Royal Academy, teaching a lot of people. A lot of the masters of his day are learning under him. They're coming from all over the world. A lot of Americans. Robert Fulton's one of them. Later on, Samuel Morse would come over, invented Morse code. He was also a very talented painter. Many others too. Well, it's Robert Fulton's turn, and they go over there, and he meets him, and they're living together. And you gotta imagine the ball breaking going on between the two of them. These American expatriates living in England now, and there's no TV, there's no radio, there's no other form of entertainment other than each other, and it's probably a crazy friendship that they have. But Robert Fulton is also a master tinkerer. He's got this mechanical aptitude that it's going to be hard to measure, because there's no civil engineering schools, and there's none of that. He just happens to look at things, figure things out. He invents things in his head. He makes things, most of them work. One of the things that's over in England that's got the whole world curious is the Watt engine. England's got a huge advantage with this engine, and tinkerers from all over the world, including France and America, are going over there to try and get a look at this engine and see how it works. And Robert Fulton knew detail, and he looked at something. He could figure it out in his mind how all this stuff was working. So his mission was to get as close as he could to that engine and see how it works. So, being the very gifted, talented artist he was able to get access to people who can get him access to other people, so he could take a look at this engine. Perhaps the great American painter Robert Fulton is here. Oh, well, let's show him our engine. Another guy that tinkered, another guy in that era was Oliver Evans. Evans invented a steam engine as well, and he put it in other applications before he got into steamboats. Evans built flour mills, he built textile machines, and factories started to now begin to mass produce exponentially. He got a lot of investors interested in his ideas. A lot of his investors were investing $4 million. Fitch or Rumsey, the Rumseys, came over to him, and he was getting into now high pressure steam engines. With Fulton and Livingston were doing a low pressure. Stevens got into high pressure engines too, a little bit differently. They were really careful. Oliver Evans was kind of a, he was a little bit out there. He was, go, more. And then he built a class of steamships that were using high pressure engines, and one of them they named after him, but he changed the name to the Constitution. And the Constitution exploded and killed all 11 crew members on board, and he was devastated. Dangerous work. There's no safety guidelines. There's no OSHA. These are just guys trying stuff. And trying to make it work and pushing the envelope a little further. Boom. Everybody's dead. Pick yourself up. Do it again. Get it together. Shake it off. Move forward. That took a lot out of him. I think he lived about 2 years after that. He died. But the foundation he set up went on to do many things. Chancellor Livingston has to make a deal with Napoleon for the port of New Orleans, because this is huge. This is a game changer if he gets that. So here's Livingston. He has a game changer in each hand. He's got the steam ferries, and he's got the Louisiana Purchase. Thomas Jefferson says, I'll give $3 million for the port of New Orleans, or up to $11 million for the Louisiana territory, which is pretty much just the state of Louisiana. He just wanted that port. Okay, so the first thing Livingston has to do, he has to convince the French that they don't need that land over there. So he's going to do whatever Thomas Jefferson tells him, because Livingston himself has wildly ambitious political aspirations. He wants to take the big chair one day. He's still young enough. He still thinks he has the chance. So he wants to do what he can to please Jefferson. But he notices that Jefferson surrounds himself with a bunch of Virginian Southern gentlemen like Jefferson, and unlike Livingston, who's just a different kind of person, I guess. He's a New Yorker. So he goes over and he convinces, he doesn't talk to Napoleon directly yet. He talks to Napoleon's buffer ring. And these French guys are able to convince Napoleon, sell the land. It was a pretty daunting task, but they managed to do it. But Napoleon smartly says, look, I can't just sell you New Orleans, or for that matter, Louisiana, because the rest of it that we own would be no good to us if we can't. It's landlocked. We can't get to it. So you got to take the whole thing. You got to take everything from New Orleans all the way up to Canada and then all the way over to the Rocky Mountains. Okay, and I want $20 million. Take it all. So Livingston says, whatever New York says, and, all right, let me talk to my people. So he goes back and he writes letters to James Madison. He can't talk to Jefferson directly anyway. He's got to go through Jefferson's. Napoleon, he's got his buffer ring, and James Madison is the one, he corresponds with. Madison ignores him. He writes another letter, ignores him again. He writes like 3 letters, and they're paying no attention. Meanwhile, these letters aren't like an email or a phone call you can make. They're, they take weeks, to go over there. Weeks going by, months going by. Napoleon's there tapping his foot, wondering what's going on. Livingston doesn't know what to do. He's completely frustrated. So finally he writes a scathing letter. I mean, the New York in him comes out, and he just, he lays into these guys. And he writes them this letter, and Madison, I guess they took it the wrong way, or maybe they took it the way they're supposed to. But he writes a letter back and says, look, relax, tough guy. We're sending over our guy, James Monroe. This is future President James Monroe. And now Livingston realizes what's going on. James Monroe is honest, he's a great guy. He's younger than most of them. But he's studying law under Thomas Jefferson. So he knows he's in that clique, and Livingston isn't. So Monroe shows up, and he said, what's going on? He says, look, this is the deal. Napoleon wants $20 million for everything. Jefferson said no more than 11. So Monroe doesn't know what to do. He's just, following orders. And so he pretty much says, well, let's see what we can get. So they go and they negotiate, and I think they get the price down to $15 million. And so Livingston signs off on it. It's a great deal by all things. And he gets an awful lot of property for very, very little, trade-off. And Jefferson lays into him. Jefferson is furious, or at least acts furious. And he gives all the blame to Livingston. And he gives Monroe all the credit. So he snubs Livingston. But Livingston recognizes that there's another form of power that's even more powerful than perhaps his political ambitions, and that is when he meets Robert Fulton and decides to go in the business of steam. Fulton's trying to get close to the water engine. This is England's prize jewel. Very few people get to have the access to this. I mean, maybe they could see it, but they can't. Fulton wants to get in, get his hands on it, and work on it a little bit, and that's like a big no-no. You're not getting anywhere near that engine. If you're a foreigner, especially a rebel American. But Fulton's, fascinated with what it can do, and he knows what Napoleon knows, what the emperors of ancient Babylonia knew. You rule the water, you can rule the world. So he's got these steam shovels in mind. He wants to move Earth, and so he becomes fascinated with canal building, and he decides to go over to France with some of the best canal builders who are over there, and he makes friends with them pretty easily. I mean, he's an artist. Everybody knows his work. Very gifted. And sure, they come over, they talk to him, and they got these mechanical operations that are leveraging, the earth, and that's fine. But he's got the steam engine in his head, and so he knows he could do way, way better. And so they introduce him to Robert Livingston, and the two of these guys hit it off like immediately. They have a lot in common. They really admire each other's work. These two would create a business partnership that would change the world. Eventually, Robert Fulton would marry into Livingston's family. He'd marry his second cousin, Harriet Livingston, whose mother was from the Schuler dynasty. So now he has 2 big New York names he's marrying into. And the Schulers are the same family that Alexander Hamilton married into. So, talk to Hamilton about the Schulers. One of the big New York, Livingston, Schuler, Van Rensselaer, Roosevelt. Those are all the top big names. Beekman, Clintons are another one. There's probably good 15, 20 names. But the Livingstons and the Schulers are up in the top 5, possibly, in the top 3 spot too. But Fulton and Hamilton brought a lot to the table, let's be honest. So this is all starting to sound like one big dysfunctional, family. It's true, they married into each other's families and fought over everything. And Livingston is able to introduce Fulton to Napoleon. And Napoleon is fascinated with this Fulton character that's, got these brilliant ideas. He's over there, he saw the engine, and he thinks he can make one here. He makes one, and it's wrong. He makes it again, he fixes the problem. That one doesn't work either. He makes it again, this one works a little bit. But he never gives up. Fulton just keeps going until he gets this thing right. He gets enough of it right to convince Napoleon that he could build all these, secret weapons, and Napoleon is here like this evil Bond villain. He's trying to take over the world, and he got his Q, who could build these futuristic weapons like submarines and torpedoes, and so he gives Robert Fulton whatever Robert Fulton needs, and Robert Fulton goes to work and he builds these submarines that work. They go like 20-25 feet under the water, and he builds torpedoes and mines, and they work. But the English, they see what's coming, and they're ready for it, and they still beat Napoleon in little skirmishes here and there, and so Napoleon kind of gives up on Fulton, and Livingston convinces Fulton to go into business with him and his ferries, and between the two of them, they conspire this plan to get the Watt engine from England and bring it to America. And through Livingston's connections and Robert Fulton's finessing, and the two of them, they managed to get the Watt engine out of England. I think it's the first one in history to leave the country. And where does it go? It goes to freaking America by two New Yorkers named Rob. They got this engine now. Back in New York, these guys set up a company that rivals Stevens' company, who's got ferry routes running from New York City to Hoboken, New Jersey, other places too. First thing he does is he exercises monopoly. Robert Livingston decides the harbor's his, so he tells Stevens to get lost. And while Stevens was securing patent law, Livingston went out and got the monopoly on the river. So, patent law or not, you can't put your boats on the Hudson River without Livingston's permission. And that just, infuriated poor Stevens. He tried so hard. And these guys, they fight. I'm sure that, our founding fathers didn't all get along. Neither did our inventors, neither did our artists, neither did our, but you had to get something done. It got done, but it didn't come without costs, and that cost a lot of friendships, it cost a lot of relationships, and eventually it would cost some lives. There wasn't anybody around to teach any of these guys this stuff. Pretty much they did it on their own. They were self-motivated, self-taught, and they figured it out and made some mistakes, quite a few mistakes, but everybody after them would stand on their shoulders. They were the pioneers. And Stevens was a whole other layer of paranoia. You really got to admire what he did. A lot of his work, was done at night. His closest allies were his own sons. His own method of propulsion should give it away. I mean, there were screws that turned underwater. Nobody could see it, and very protective. In fact, Stevens came up with the whole patent law to protect himself. Introduced that in 1790. The lawyer, Columbia grad, King's College, but he took his ferry on the ocean. His ferry with the twin screws. They were underwater. When you saw John Stevens' ferry moving across the water, you had no idea what was propelling that thing. It was hidden. Whereas the paddle wheel, which was invented by another inventor called Nicholas Roosevelt, the granduncle of Theodore Roosevelt, was an inventor too. The Roosevelts were a very powerful family of Dutch descent. Roosevelt married the daughter of Benjamin Latrobe. Now, Benjamin Latrobe is one of his investors, his best friend, his business partner. He was a very famous architect. You might recognize some of his work. He was employed by Thomas Jefferson to build the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. He invented the paddle wheel, the vertical paddle wheel. And Robert Fulton liked that application. And so them three got together, Livingston and Fulton and Roosevelt. And they put together a ferry boat with a paddle wheel. Of course, it stops in Claremont, New York, where the Chancellor Livingston lives, and so people call it the Claremont. They didn't really give it a fancy name like Stevens called his the Phoenix, rising out of the ashes, from his myth with Livingston. And the other thing about the Stevens is their steam engine was built in America, whereas Fulton's was exported. They had the Watt engine, and by taking it apart and putting it back together 50 million times, Robert Fulton knew how to build one of his own, and that was the strength of Fulton-Livingston enterprise. Once Roosevelt came in and Jefferson got the port of New Orleans, now they get to put steamboats on the Mississippi River, and this is a whole game changer. And they build their boat called the New Orleans in Pittsburgh, and he makes a journey from Pittsburgh to New Orleans on this ferry boat. And this story plays out like a true Walt Disney movie. Roosevelt takes his new wife. He has a baby with her. Her name is Rosetta, or Rose, and he has a pilot. He's got about 10 deckhands. He's got 2 servants for his wife. She's pregnant again with their second child. And they take this trip down the Mississippi River. And they got their dog Tiger. I looked everywhere to try and find the type of dog that they had, the breed of dog. It's out there somewhere. And they take this ride down the Mississippi for the first official time to New Orleans. They're going to try and do it in 14 days. It's possible. Except they stop in different cities to show this boat off. And people never see anything like this. They run out there and they're chasing it down the beach. And it's going down the Mississippi. They're stoking the fire and sparks are shooting out. And everybody's oohing and eyeing. It's really an awesome sight to see. Along the way, they get a fire break out on the boat. They fought the fire. They won. They got attacked by Native Americans. There was an earthquake. There was a hurricane. And then Lydia gives birth to their son Henry on board. So they pull into New Orleans. Finally, I think they're a little bit late, but they get there, and now they're convinced that the world changed now. Now, we got steam power. Now they changed the world, okay? Because for 3,500 years in ancient Egypt, nothing advanced. This is crazy. That the people in 325 AD woke up and did the same stuff people in 3000 BC did with no advancement at all. The nomadic tribes finally settled in. They built their farms and their farm tools, and they lived in this Eden-like bliss for almost 3,500 years. Nothing advanced. The human progress line was a steady, stream of just nothing until the Greek and Roman empires developed, and then they started to evolve a little bit. But people realized that the more questions found answers to, there were just more questions. So they just, what the heck, we'll just live on a farm and be happy. Well, then everything kind of went along, and the printing press, and then a little along, went up a little, and then something else, and went up a little, and now the line of progress hits England in 1774, and the line of progress goes, BAM! The steam engine. And it kind of stops there a little bit, because England keeps it to itself, and now these guys named Rob take it from England to America. And boom, the steam engine just changes the world, like immeasurably, in such a small amount of time. We advance it in steamboats, and steam trains, and locomotives, and all kinds of factory implications, and all kinds of, everything just goes and goes and accelerates, and it doubles and triples the speed of how man advances. And now it's no longer 3,000 years before somebody goes somewhere. Now it's, our children are teaching us their technology, because it even passes us. That all started with two guys named Rob that brought that steam engine to America and opened up that Pandora's box of just knowledge and technology, information, and just Yankee ingenuity and American, stick-to-itiveness. One of the great things about being a New Yorker is, the advancements we make, and that's power. Malachy Murray, New York Talk. See you in September.